All right, so we are live and recording. My name is Sarah Bowerly-Dansman, and I'm an assistant professor of international studies at the Hamilton Lugar School of Global and International Studies here at Indiana University Bloomington. And I am the current steering committee chair of the Tobias Center, which is located in the Hamilton Lugar School and supports faculty research and student experiences related to international development. Just admitting some more people into the room. And so before I introduce today's speaker, I want to overview some quick housekeeping procedures. As I mentioned, the session is being recorded and will be made available on the Tobias Center's website. So please keep yourself muted throughout today's presentation unless you're asking a question. Please also take a moment to be sure that your name is correctly displayed in Zoom and rename yourself if necessary. The speaker will present for about 25 minutes, and then we will have 30 minutes for Q&A, which I will moderate. So we will be taking clarifying questions during the presentation, and Niels has mentioned that he's happy to kind of moderate that himself. So if you have questions that are more clarifying questions, please feel free to raise your hand or ask those questions in the chat. But please do save the more kind of conceptually complex questions for the Q&A at the end. You can ask to be placed in the question queue through the chat function when that happens. Alternatively, you can type your question into the chat if you would rather not speak. Please reserve the chat for this function rather than, other kind of conversations. Please also pencil into your calendars our final talk for the semester. On November 3rd, Mark Dallas will present work joint with Eric Thune, Timothy Sturgeon, and Daria Taglioni on massive modularity and global value chains, moving beyond chains to ecosystems. This talk will be held on Zoom from 12 to 1 Eastern time. And please send me a direct message through the chat function or send me an email to ensure that you will be on the mailing list for those future events if you did not already receive a email for this event. If you received an email from this event, you can be assured that you are already on our mailing list. So with that out of the way, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Niels Johannesen is professor of economics at the University of Copenhagen. Most of his research revolves around tax evasion and the use of tax havens by firms and wealthy households, which is back in the news these days. His work has been published in journals such as the American Economic Review, Journal of Political Economy, Journal of the European Economic Association, and Economic Journal. Oh, the Association and Economic Journal, excuse me, I'm not as familiar with that particular journal. Professor Johannesen will be presenting very exciting work on the concept of Phantom FDI entitled, What is Real and What is Not in the Global FDI Network. With that, I will turn the floor over to him.
Thank you very much for this introduction. So thanks for having me and thanks for attending the talk. I'm really looking forward to this. And so do you see my slides now? Yeah. So this is joint work with two Danish colleagues. So one Jannick at the Danish Central Bank and one Thomas Elkjaer at the IMF. As a part of the departure, let me just say that economists typically consider FDI a key dimension of economic integration. Why do they do that? Well, because they think that FDI really promotes growth, in particular by transferring technology, by transferring superior organizational practices across borders. And FDI is also often explicit objective for policy, so governments really want to attract FDI, and we also, so the FDI also typically enters some indexes. When we try to measure globalization, we create indices, and FDI often enters here, just showing how important a dimension of globalization we think this is. However, you don't need to stare at FDI statistics for very long to realize that FDI is not only about real economic ties. And so one example that is particularly striking is Luxembourg. So if you look in these FDI statistics, you will see that Luxembourg has inward FDI of around $4 trillion. So Luxembourg is a tiny country with around 500,000 people, yet they have inward FDI that is like approximately as much as the entire US or as much as the 5 major EU economies combined. What is happening here? Well, I'm not going to be able to tell you, exactly what the underlying reasons for this, but it's important to just note that many of the tax avoidance strategies that we know of, that they will involve large nominal investments in offshore financial centers. So this is just like if firms are employing these tax avoidance strategies, it will often lead to these large stocks of inward FDI in tax havens. So Luxembourg is not the only country that features kind of prominently in this global FDI network. So this chart here just plots the top 20 countries in terms of inward FDI, and then I've colored what we usually think of as offshore financial centers red, and other countries as blue. And you can see that among the top 20 here, almost half of them are offshore financial centers. There's Netherlands, Luxembourg, there's Hong Kong, Switzerland, Singapore, Bermuda, the British Virgin Islands, Cayman Islands are all in the top 20. And note that this is really kind of in absolute numbers. It's not like relative to GDP or anything like this. It's really kind of in absolute dollar numbers. These tiny countries are among the biggest recipients of FDI. So it's pretty clear, I think, from this picture that we know that some of the FDI is real. But it's also clear that some of the FDI is not real here. It just cannot be that that Bermuda, for example, has $1,000 billion of kind of real foreign direct investment. So what we're trying to do in this paper is really to disentangle in this FDI network. So the FDI that you can consider real and the one that is not real, which we label Phantom FDI in this paper. And of course, first we need to take a stand on it. What do I mean by real? What do I mean by phantom? And so we start by defining Phantom FDI as investment into empty corporate jets. Right? So if we have a cross-border investment that goes into a corporation that has no employees and has no substantial links to the local economy, we're going to say this is not real FDI because nothing is really happening in this shell. This is phantom FDI. And so our goal here is then to estimate, you could say, the global FDI network, while always kind of keeping separate the phantom part and the real part. And we're going to use a number of data sources. We're going to start with the standard source of FDI information, which is the Coordinated Direct Investment Survey, the CDIS. And what does that give you? That gives you for many countries, it will tell you what is the FDI by immediate investor country into the reporting country. But it does not distinguish between phantom FDI and real FDI, and it does not tell you who is what is the ultimate investor country. So that's kind of the two major limitations of that standard data set. So then we enrich that with other data, and in particular, we're going to use two types of new statistics from OECD countries. One reported by a number of countries where they basically split the total FDI coming into and going out of the country into a part that goes into special purpose entities and one does not. And these SPEs, the special purpose entities, really correspond quite directly to what we think of as phantom FDI. So if we have investment into an SPE, we'll say this is what we call phantom FDI. There's another strand of statistics here, which is where countries try to split incoming FDI not by the immediate investor country, but by the ultimate investor country, and we're also going to use that. And then finally, we'll leverage this global firm database that is called ORBIS that you might have heard about too. And I'll be more precise about how we use these different data sources to get the best possible, we think, split of real and phantom FDI. So in terms of just to give you a concrete idea of what we're trying to achieve, it's useful to have a look at, like a very stylized corporate group structure. So imagine we have this company in the US that wants to, like invest into a German company. Maybe they have acquired a company in Germany. And this is like a real US company buying, like a real plant in Germany, for example. And this often happens in the following way: that the US company will not invest directly into the German company, but they will invest into a Luxembourg holding company, which is really, nothing but a paper tiger. And that Luxembourg company will then invest into the German company. And let's just say that the investment is $100. So how will that be then recorded in standard FDI statistics? Well, in standard FDI statistics, everything is by immediate investor country, and we don't distinguish between what is real and what is phantom. We don't distinguish investments into real operational companies and to shell companies. So what we're going to see in standard FDI statistics is like an investment of $100 from the US into Luxembourg, and another investment from Luxembourg of $100 into Germany. That means that, so if you sum that, so then this will look like a $200 investment in global FDI statistics. That's one thing. It's really just $100 being invested from the US into Germany, but here you will see like a global FDI of $200. And also you will see no link between the US and Germany. You'd only see a link from the US into Luxembourg and from Luxembourg into Germany. So what we're trying to achieve here is to say, well, what we really think is happening here is that there's a real foreign direct investment from the US into Germany of $100. So there would be a real FDI of $100 here. And then there's $100 of Phantom FDI into Luxembourg. So globally, this structure will give rise to $100 of real FDI and $100 of Phantom FDI. And we'll see this link from Germany to the US. So we also construct, based on this network here, some tax avoidance indicators that basically says, well, we cannot say whether like this Luxembourg company is motivated by tax avoidance, but at least it gives like the company some tax avoidance opportunities. So basically this structure here will, in our terminology here, it will increase the US exposure to tax evasion through outward FDI by $100. And it will increase the German exposure to tax avoidance on its inward FDI by $100. Again, we don't know whether these tax avoidance opportunities are used or not, but at least there's exposure to these tax avoidance opportunities. All right, so just one picture that kind of summarizes the results. So once we built this database, so what do we find? Well, if you look at the last year here in our sample period, 2017, you'll see that so global FDI amounts to around $40 trillion. Around 15 trillion of those are phantom. And the remaining, like a bit more than 20 trillion is real. So around 40% of all the FDI that we see in the world is just into these empty shells with no like relation to the local economy, no employees, no real activity going on. And only 60% is what we can think of as real FDI. And the share of phantom here has been going up slowly year after year, up to almost 40% in 2007. All right, so that was the introduction, the motivation, and a brief look at the results. So let me talk about the method here. So what do we do? So the first step, we have 3 steps. The first step is really just to complete a network of standard FDI data as much as possible. So we start from the completely standard source, the Coordinated Direct Investment Survey, where we have 122 countries that report the inward FDI by the immediate investor country. Right, so that would be the US reporting, we get this much from Canada, this much from Germany, and so on. So that's only 122 countries, so there are many countries that don't contribute to this survey. And here what we do is just simple to use mirror outward FDI data when there is no inward FDI data available in this database. For example, the Cayman Islands does not report anything And so you could say it doesn't report inward FDI from Canada, but in this database, we can see that Canada reports outward FDI to the Cayman Islands for 34 billion. And so we'll set the inward FDI of the Cayman Islands from Canada at 34 billion. All right. So this is just basically using this mirror data from the outward FDI statistics to complete some cells when they're empty. And it's not completely true that we use this data directly. We make a small adjustment to account for the fact that there is usually a little discrepancy between inward and outward data when we have both. Okay, so that was not very controversial and probably not a very big contribution. So that the key step here is the next one. We're trying to split the measure of total FDI that we see in the database into what is phantom and what is real. And so clearly there are some countries that have started reporting this, the amount of FDI that is going into these special purpose entities. And that gives us, for a set of countries, we actually have directly from these new data, we have a measure of, phantom FDI and by implication also real FDI. And so the challenge is now, how can we estimate the split for all the other countries in the world that do not themselves report the split between SPs and non-SPs? And so the intuitive idea here is that when you see a country that has a very large stock of total FDI relative to the size of the economy, only a small share of that will be real and a large share will be phantom. So we're going to take the countries that do report the split themselves, and then we're going to estimate that the structural relation between this FDI intensity, so how large is FDI relative to GDP, and the real FDI share, so how much of total FDI is real. And once we have estimated that relationship, we'll just extrapolate that to all the non-reporting countries. So this is, so how does it look in practice? We just estimate this simple equation here, where we have the real FDI share on the left-hand side, the log of that. We have the FDI intensity on the right-hand side, so total FDI over GDP, also the log of that. And we have potentially some control variables. And once we have estimated this for the reporting countries, we'll just extrapolate it to the non-reporting countries, so we can see this. So we have that from our first step, but we don't have this. We'll just extrapolate that. So this is how the data looks. This is just plotting all our data points for these reporting countries. And you can see it's a pretty decent fit that you have three in from. You have a whole bunch of countries here that just have very little, that they report a split between real and phantom, but there's almost no phantom. Then there are three important countries. So there's Luxembourg down here. There's the Netherlands here and Hungary that is driving this really the slope here, saying that the more total FDI that you get, the smaller a share of that will be real. So this is just pooled for 5 years, and of course, when you see this, you might be suspicious that that this is really not very strong, because it's only 15 countries, and we are extrapolating to many other countries in the world. Should you believe this? I think so. There are a number of reasons why this is fairly believable. So one is, for example, that this relationship between FDI intensity and the real FDI share is very robust to controls. So you can control for GDP in that relation. You can control for GDP per capita. You can control for trade, or you can control for all three things at the same time. And basically the relation here that we're interested in doesn't change at all, which is quite remarkable given the small sample size here. You can also use different time periods. If you just use one period at a time, you basically get the same relation in every year. You can exclude individual countries from the sample, and basically no matter what country you exclude, you get the same regression line, except if you exclude Luxembourg, which is the big outlier down here, you get a slightly different relationship, and we're going to look into how that would matter for our ultimate results if we just discard Luxembourg completely from the analysis. So just assuming that we've gotten at the right relationship here, we're going to now extrapolate to all the other countries in the world. and it will give you this picture here. And so this is basically the estimated relationship in levels between the FDI intensity and the share of real FDI. And the green dots here is the one that we actually see in the data, so the reported ones, and the blue dots are going to be the predicted ones. We don't actually know the outcome, we have predicted it from the structural relation between the countries reporting. And you can see, like, not surprisingly, right, that the countries that we assign like a very, or we estimate like a very small, like real FDI share are countries like the Cayman Islands, Bermuda, Gibraltar, Falkland Islands, so these very tiny known tax havens. So that was the exercise we were trying to assign, or like to split the stock of inward FDI into a part that is phantom and a part that is real. This gives you kind of the split for each of these the countries in our sample. The last thing we're trying to do is to try to take a part of the FDI into a country that is real and try to allocate it to the ultimate owner economies, or the ultimate investor economies. And how do we do that? Well, again, we have a new data source, which is a number of OECD countries that have started reporting this directly. Okay, so they're saying we want to report not just our FDI stock by immediate investor country, but also by the ultimate investor country. So in our example before, it would be like Germany reporting that the US is the ultimate owner of the investment coming from Luxembourg. And then there are many countries that don't report this, and here we rely on this ORBIS database. So basically what we do here is that, again, we start from this standard statistic. So in the CDIS data set, we see that FDI in Spain from immediate owners in the US is 23 billion. And what we're interested in is like how much investment is there from ultimate investors in the US. And here we then use ORBIS to step up these 23 billion to an estimate for the US. So basically we are saying in ORBIS, we see that FDI in Spain from immediate owners in the US is 13 billion. We see that FDI in Spain from ultimate owners in the US is 29 billion, suggesting that there's a little more than twice as much FDI from ultimate than from immediate US investors. And we're going to use that scaling factor then to step up our 23 billion that we see in the standard statistics to our estimate of around 50 billion. So it's just going to be the 23 in the standard statistics times this factor 29 divided by 13, around 15. All right, I have a few minutes now to present the findings in a bit more detail. So of course, just this plot is meant to kind of illustrate a little bit the uncertainties underlying this exercise that are of course not trivial. So the black line here is actually what you've seen before. It just gives you the amount of the total FDI stock that we think is phantom FDI in our baseline estimates. The green line is one where we have excluded Luxembourg from the original exercise, saying that that's an outlier. We are like worried whether that's something structural. So we take that out and repeat the whole exercise, and we get the green line, suggesting that will change the slope of the structural relationship that we take out at the most important country, but it doesn't really change our ultimate estimates. If you're really conservative and you think that everything we're doing is just hoax, then you can say, well, the only thing I believe is phantom FI is when a country itself reports that it's FDI into an empty shell, and that is the blue line. So clearly, if you think that all the FDI into the Cayman Islands is real FDI, and only the phantom FDI reported by Luxembourg and the Netherlands and a few other havens is the phantom part, then you get to the blue line that's clearly like a lot smaller, but still not completely trivial, saying that maybe then the real number is not a 15 trillion, but only say 7 trillion. If you go the other way and say, well, I think that everything, all the FDI going into kind of a list of typically of jurisdictions typically considered offshore centers, you get the red line. So that is just basically summing all the FDI going into Switzerland, Luxembourg, Cayman Islands, and so on. you get around 20 trillion instead of our baseline estimate of 15 billion. So this is just to say, well, there's clearly uncertainty here about but we think that the order of magnitude is probably right, and that you can argue that we are both, I mean, it's not clear whether we are under or overestimating the quantities here. Another, like, so this figure then plots where this Phantom FDI is. So here you see the top 20 recipients of Phantom FDI, and you'll see that they're all offshore financial centers, which also, you know, like makes us think that this procedure is not completely crazy. And of these jurisdictions, so then the bold red is the self-reported values of Phantom FDI, whereas the lighter colored red here is all the estimated stocks. A really nice thing, I think, is here that we're trying to quantify in a new way, like these real investment link between the ultimate investor country and the ultimate investment country, kind of looking through this whole chain of offshore entities. And so this illustrates what happens in the process. So here I picked out the 5 biggest countries in the world by FDI, and I plot here the bilateral FDI stock, both as it appears in the standard FDI data and in our estimates. And you can see for all these like big investor countries, you can see that the link becomes stronger when you follow a procedure to estimate the real FDI link and get rid of all the noise that comes through these offshore investments. And also you can show this in different ways, just by doing a simple gravity equation, where you can say that, I mean, the real factors in a gravity equation, so the GDP and the distance, well, they have around 25% more explanatory power when we use the real FDI links as the outcome, as opposed to the FDI links that you observe like in standard statistics. So this also convinces us that we are getting at something real here when we estimate so real FDI stocks. We can also quantify with this exercise what is known as round tripping, which is basically like, so what part of the FDI going into a country comes from ultimate owners in the country itself, right? So one example is for example, Chinese, who will invest into China, but through a Hong Kong corporation. That's like a typical frequent structure. And you can see that in China, so almost, I mean, more than 25% of all FDI going into China is, according to our estimates, so ultimately owned by Chinese, and therefore not really FDI, but just like domestic investment. You see that varies quite a lot across countries. The last thing I want to show you is just how these tax avoidance indicators then look. So basically, I won't have time to talk much about the detail here, but basically, so this just gives you a number for each country that tells you something about, so what share of the country's outward FDI happens through an empty shell in this intermediate country. And you can see there's a lot of variation here with, like, for Brazil, it's over 80% of their outward FDI that is going into this empty shell before it reaches like a real object, whereas it's much smaller for other countries. And this is similar for inward FDI. So again, like, so what share of the FDI you're receiving is coming from an empty shell? So that quantifies your exposure to the kind of tax avoidance on your inward FDI investment. So that finishes my presentation. So just in summary, our starting point is that, you know, when you look at standard FDI statistics, you see crazy things just because they confound the real part with something that is just not real, which is all these investments into empty shells where, like, there are no ties to the real economy or anything real going on. Which means that, you know, like, you cannot use these standard statistics to assess like the strength of the real economic ties. And you cannot, if you're like a public finance person, you cannot really measure like how much like this tax motivated FDI matters. And so we're trying to crack that by estimating the FDI network, separating separating phantom and real FDI as well as we can. And what we find is that the phantom FDI accounts for around 40% of total FDI globally. Almost all of the phantom FDI is into like known offshore financial centers. And I mean, the patterns here are, of course, suggestive of tax avoidance to the extent where you believe that a lot of these offshore investments are really motivated by some tax avoidance purpose. Thanks very much, and sorry for going a few minutes over time. And I'm looking forward to discuss all this with you and answer any questions that you may have. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Niels, and thank you for getting through so much of your presentation in a timely fashion, but also providing a lot of clarity in terms of your process. So we have a growing queue. Let's start with Ryan Welds. I'm sorry, Ryan, I don't know how to pronounce your last name. Please go.
Welzius.
Please. I'm sorry.
Welzius.
Welzius. Okay, so Ryan, you're up for your question.
Great. Thank you. And thank you for the presentation, Niels. It's very interesting. My question, I think, hopefully is pretty simple. I noticed that this is all just speaking about general levels of FDI, but can you say anything about different sectors? Because I'm assuming that there's going to be a widening gap between the real and the phantom in sectors like finance, but potentially in sectors that you actually need to build a factory, for instance, manufacturing, there may be a smaller gap. So I'm wondering if you have been able to tease out the gaps in different sectors yet, or if the code that you've provided on your webpage, if that could potentially be attributed to or be used to look at the different sectors.
So that is super interesting, but I think that we are really unable to address that question just because like the basic FDI data that we're starting from are not by sector, but they're just like for the aggregate economy. And I'm just wondering whether there is something else you could do. I guess, I mean, so with the ORBIS data, you could do different things. And in ORBIS, you always have like the sector of the corporations involved. And I mean, that's of course like another thing that we have not really looked enough into. So you could, I guess, like the whole exercise, we're trying to disentangle phantom and real. You can also try to do that with ORBIS data, because in ORBIS you also see like how many employees corporations have and so on. And I guess our concern was just that in ORBIS, you know that you have this underrepresentation of tax havens, and in particular of the offshore industry. So our guess would be that you just capture too little in ORBIS of that. But if you were willing to go that way, I guess that would be the one way to get at the sectors.
Thank you.
I share your intuition that probably there will be big sectoral differences, and something like finance would be a place to look for even larger gaps.
I'm going to assert some privilege here and two-finger that question, because the what you brought up, Niels, about the use of ORBIS. I use ORBIS for other projects that I'm currently working on, and it's a fantastic source that's also greatly unwieldy and hard to understand some of its strengths. So I would be really curious if you could tell us a little bit more about how you actually went about finding that FDI data in ORBIS, because when I've used ORBIS, everything's reported at the firm level, and I can go through and through a very complicated process find cross-border mergers and acquisitions, but it takes a long time. Are you looking at the at financial statements, or how are you compiling that?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So the first thing is to say, so for each corporation that is owned that has a foreign owner, you want to know like what is the value of that investment. And that will depend, and here you want to basically So what you have is like the total equity, and you also have the so that will be one measure of the value of the investment. So there will be like measured.
But that's a stock. That's a stock rather than.
But this is all about stocks. So we're only doing stocks. This is all about stocks. So so one complication here is that actually FDI measures investment both in the form of equity and debt. So so we are doing something to just say, well, when there is debt, how much is usually owned by like affiliates, and how much is usually owned by external banks and others. So we cannot see that in ORBIS, but we are just taking an average number that we know and kind of impose it on every single corporation that we see. So then that gives us like a measure of the value of each corporation that is owned by a foreign owner. And then the other thing is, of course, like how do we see these links? And here you really, that's the biggest strength of ORBIS, I think, is that you always see kind of like who is, if there is another corporation owning a corporation, you'll see who that corporation is. And that's going to be the immediate investor who owns the shares in the corporation. And you're also going to see who's the ultimate investor, or at least the ultimate investor country. So that's basically part of the data that you see in ORBIS directly is like this information about the owners. And that will tell you like what foreign country should you assign that FDI to, whether you look at like immediate owners or ultimate owners. Does that correspond to what you see in ORBIS, or am I making things up here?
Yes, but it also seems like then it's quite a convoluted process of downloading that data and cleaning it to bring it into the format that you want. But I want to move on to the next person, because I want to make sure that I'm not taking over the Q&A. But I'm curious about that. So maybe we can follow up a little bit later. So Lucas, you are up next. And Lucas, I'm so glad that you're here. You've done some really fantastic work on this same issue. So floor is yours.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks so much, Niels, for a great presentation and wonderful work. I think it's going to be very useful for many of us, so thanks a lot for that. So actually, I also wanted to ask about the ORBIS data, so I had the same question that Sarah had. Maybe you can say a bit more about that, because I was wondering about this M&A versus greenfield aspect, right, which I'm not sure if you really get that from ORBIS, right? So especially the M&A, I've worked a little bit with it, and I haven't never seen it. But that's just maybe a small question. You don't have to respond.
I'd be happy to.
Okay, please do. I have two other questions, but please go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. So we don't use any particular M&A data because we are only estimating stocks. We just we look at all the corporations we find in ORBIS. We assign a value to them. And then we assign them to a foreign investor country if they have a foreign investor, immediate investor, and ultimate investor country. And I think that should really be in the information about that should be like a corporation level variable, like what country is the owner in and what country is the ultimate owner in. So it really shouldn't be so hard, I think, but maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, let's hope maybe it would be useful to kind of plot the evolution over time in ORBIS versus the FDI, that if you have similar trends, that will probably help to convince. So
I think there's a lot more work to be done to reconcile ORBIS with FDI statistics, like more generally. I think that will be super important for everybody, like to know more how this database that we all use a lot, like how it compares to official statistics.
Absolutely. Yeah, and my two other questions. The first one is about this extrapolation from those who did report versus those who didn't. And if I got it right from the slides, those who do report are almost all European countries. And so that made me wonder a bit, because of the common market levels of FDI are fairly high in Europe, and my intuitive guess would be that it's lower in most other parts of the world. So I wonder whether that might be potentially some putting some bias here that you're looking at countries which have a lot of FDI. And my other question, and just a very small one, is about the round tripping FDI where you showed. I was surprised that India was so low, because there's like some studies that talk about the India-Mauritius relationship, and they found some, as I remember, that there was a story that India was one of the biggest places. So I was wondering if you have an idea why that doesn't show up in your data. But yeah, so I'll leave it at that. Thanks so much for your work.
Thank you very much. I mean, so the first question, so it relates to this figure here. And I mean, it's absolutely true that most of the, I mean, I don't think they're all European. I think the US is in there as well, but they're clearly all, they're all OECD countries, and they're all high income countries. And you know, and this relation, you know, of course it could look different in other parts of the world. I think it's just that there's something very, so I think the harder you think about this, the more you realize that it is like a very kind of fundamental relationship, that, you know, like if you have a very high fraction of FDI to GDP, it's just that it can't just all be real, because the economy can only absorb so much real FDI. So, and this, I think this is why it really, it is so, so strong and so robust, but of course, you know, it is like extrapolating from 15 countries to 200. So I cannot guarantee anything. So the other question about India and Mauritius, I think that everything we're doing here is, you know, like it might be a little bit shaky when you look at like individual country pairs. I've also heard about the India-Mauritius case study, but as far as I understand, it's not just Indians. Like it's basically all of the big share of FDI into India is going through Mauritius. So it's also foreign investors that will use Mauritius as a stepping stone, just to be able to repatriate profits at lower withholding rates. So I think that could be, it could, I mean, I think our measures here are still consistent with I mean, it does, so the Mauritius story does not imply necessarily like a very high share of FDI being owned by Indians, because as long as foreigners kind of also invest through Mauritius, could be.
Okay, that's interesting to think about that. Think about that issue of whether it's people coming from the country, like the home country, round tripping through versus using a tax haven, a foreigner kind of conduiting through before going into that host country. So next up on the list, we have Ben Graham. Ben, it's great to see you. Feel free to unmute and ask your question.
All right. Hi, Sarah. So mostly I'm in the queue just to express enthusiasm and gratitude. I think this is such a wonderful project, and I am really excited to use these data in a couple of different projects. You know, working with aggregate FDI data to test theory is always just deeply frustrating, because you don't really believe the data you're working with. And, you know, so the question though that I have, you know, I mean, you've got, you know, an R squared here of like 0.85, like you're able to take essentially a single variable to do your extrapolation with and do a pretty good predictive job. It seems like it might be possible to add a few other predictive variables that might also have pretty broad coverage and get a slightly better predictive model. You know, I was kind of thinking, you know, we might have, at least for some countries, we might have data on the size of their financial sector, or we might have data on corporate tax rates. We might have data on a couple of other things that might help us predict this phantom share, right? So sort of taking your same technique, but adding a couple more predictors. Did you toy around with that? What do you kind of view as the trade-offs here?
I think that at the end of the day, we're using this column here for the prediction, just because then we get full coverage. Then we don't lose any country. And I think, and there's clearly a trade-off between getting a better fit and you know, like then losing a few countries because you include more variables where there's not full coverage.
Yeah, but I mean, going a little Bayesian can get you around that, right? Like if it's a missing data problem, it's not like we can't figure out a way to use this information statistically if we think
Sure,
that
yeah.
information is valuable.
I agree. I think maybe it's also just recognizing that, that the uncertainty here is so large that like this little that we could gain, like would still be pretty small compared to the underlying uncertainty. So maybe there is just a limit to how much you want to make this more sophisticated, like in terms of methods, just when there's just so much uncertainty anyways.
There is a fundamental humility and parsimony, right? So I can appreciate that.
Yeah, but I think that the variables that you're pointing to are exactly the right ones, of course. So taxation and financial services would be kind of other important candidates to bring in here to improve the fit.
Thanks.
Okay, so a reminder that the queue is open, and so if anyone has a question, feel free to message me to get on the queue. I have a couple of questions that I want to ask about. I want to circle back to a question that I believe it was Lucas that brought up about sort of what might be different about the countries that are reporting their Phantom FDI directly. I know they don't call it that, right? So Lucas brought up the idea that many of these countries are European. You mentioned that they're not just all European, but they do seem like they're all OECD countries, and that they might be fundamentally different from other countries that don't report. So to the extent that, I love the idea of being able to use this database, and I think that there are lots of ways that we can do that. But if we shift our measures of FDI to that, then we're kind of fundamentally, assuming that there are a few assumptions that we want to make sure are pretty good assumptions to be making. And the one that's the most kind of potentially concerning to me is that there's a selection effect happening in terms of what countries report, and so therefore there's something off with the model. Now your modeling looks like it looks like it makes sense, but I'd love to really think about maybe some countries that maybe might be good tests of this. Like I was thinking Costa Rica. I think Costa Rica gets a lot of FDI, like compared to some other countries. And I don't think that that's because of Phantom FDI. So I was wondering how it performs on this model, and if we can pull out some other countries that similarly either we know kind of get a lot of FDI as a proportion of GDP that we know are that's mostly real, or countries that don't get very much, for regulatory barrier reasons or so forth, to sort of gain more confidence in the measure. And also kind of, I just love a little bit more of a discussion about what are the potential like political factors that might be driving some of these countries to report and others not to. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that like to the extent that you can point to countries where there are kind of specific factors that make them attract a lot of real FDI relative to the size of their local economy or very little FDI, I think then just by construction our model will perform poorly for these countries, right? Because we're really basing the prediction only on this FDI intensity. So if you say Costa Rica, just for whatever reason, it just is really good at attracting real FDI, and then we're going to have a high FDI intensity, and we're gonna predict like a small share of real FDI. So I think that's so the more of that, like idiosyncratic variation there is across country, just like how good they are at actually kind of attracting FDI, like the poorer job we will do with this very, very simple predictive model. I think ultimately, so I guess what you would hope, if being me, is that you have more countries that will start reporting. So you can kind of plot more red dots into that figure and see like how well we are doing in predicting based on the 2017 data. I think I think this is going to happen. So it's something that has a lot of attention both in the OECD and in the IMF, that you really want to improve the measurement of FDI, both like distinguishing SP investments and others, and also at assigning to ultimate owners. So I think that, I mean, this kind of data will improve in a relatively short time frame, and then of course this needs to be incorporated right into this database and recalibrate the underlying model here to make the best predictions possible. So the second question was about this reporting. So what could be the political dynamics that would lead some countries to report and others not to? That's really a great question. So I don't know. Do you have any particular thoughts yourself on this? Like why? Like, so have you done work on kind of the political politics in tax havens?
So I have not myself, but I know that this is something that a lot of political scientists are kind of really worried about, especially with missing data and kind of the extent to which missing data is not random, right?
Yeah.
I would assume that this might be an OECD, and Lucas also mentioned this, that this might be that it might be a requirement of OECD members, but I'm not sure. So I was just curious what was going on here with that.
Yeah. So my co-authors would be here because they are really, both of them, they are really working like with these statistics, and they go to these like technical like working groups for like technicians, and I'm sure they've been talking to these Luxembourg counterparts, and they would know. I think so. You could think, so what is the risk here for Luxembourg? So I guess that the risk is that they will be again, you know, exposed as a tax haven, and no one likes that. But I think the other side is probably that there could be some serious pressure on these countries where we know that there's a lot of capital is flowing through, to at the very least, you know, just tell us like a little bit about the quantities and the structure that it has. So, and there are other like examples of that. So for example, I've been working a lot with something called the locational banking statistics from the BIS, which is basically all financial centers in the world are, you know, like if they're big enough, then they're asked to basically provide a breakdown of the bank's balance sheets by counterpart country. And here you have like really like all the big tax havens represented. So they really provide this detail, you know, country by country data on deposits in their banks. And again, like the question is, why do they do that? Because it really puts them in a bad light in a sense. But I think like to start with, there was really no one who used this data to study like taxation, for example. So people would use it to study like international macro flows, but not to study tax evasion. And so I and a few others, we were the first to really start doing that. And I know that it really embarrassed the BIS, because suddenly these tax havens, they will come to the BIS meeting and say, what is going on? Like we give you this data, and now you give it to researchers who then like show that there's all this evasion going on. And so, yeah, I think there is this trade-off from the perspective of tax havens that, you know, on the one hand, they would like to comply if it's free, you know, like to and be a good student in the class, you know, like and do what they're told to do. But as long as it comes with a relatively small cost in terms of you know, exposure to bad press. I think that might be the case also here for these OECD countries.
So that's very useful. Thank you. I had one other question, because I think that, you know, a lot of us on the call are political scientists, and so I think that I think that having a better measure of FDI is really interesting in and of its own self. But I also think that studying the variation and like the distance between what was reported and what is likely accurate is also a really interesting kind of potential path forward in terms of some research questions. And I noticed if you could go to your slide that had the time series for your different expectations of, no, actually the one kind of towards the end where there were different measures. So your baseline, and then if you assumed everything in tax havens was, yeah, that one. So I noticed that there was this step up that's most pronounced for the only reported Phantom FDI between 2011 and 2012. And we also see a kind of change in the slope upwards for the other measures. I was curious if you had any thoughts on what might be driving that, or you know, if that's just sort of a part of the data that you haven't really drilled down to understand.
So I think, so you're talking about this jump up there? I'm not completely sure, but it might be just another country that starts reporting.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I wish I could tell you, but it could be just one big that starts reporting here, the split between Phantom and real.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then the you don't have a balanced, like it's not balanced through the time.
I'm embarrassed to say that I don't remember.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
So it could be balanced, and it could be just one more country starting to report. I can look that up for you, like, and get back to you with an answer. But
I'll also look through your data a little bit more, which I think will be helpful. And I know that the paper itself, it's been a little while since I read it in its entirety, but it also has a lot of additional detailed information. So I would encourage anyone who's interested in using these data to also read that carefully. Well, we're almost out of time. So if anyone has a burning question they'd like to ask, get it in now. But I also want to, in the chat, put here the link to Niels' website, which actually has the database available to download and use, of course, with proper citation. Niels, can you tell us a little bit about kind of how you might anticipate this database to be updated in the future? I'm hoping that it will be, so that we can move going forward.
That's definitely the plan. So to keep it updated and available for use. So really, I mean, I think we're hoping for two things. So one is that others will work with this methodological problem, like how can we best like measure these things, and we make even better data sets, you know, like that cover these variables. And of course, then also the people who just work with FDI, you know, that they can use our measures or the even better ones that we produce. And of course, like for that purpose, it's super important that it doesn't stop in 2007. So we do plan to update it in the not so distant future.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Niels. On behalf of the Tobias Center, we really appreciate you taking your time today to present some really important and exciting research, and also for creating a public good that all researchers who study FDI can use. So thank you very much. Thank you to our audience members for taking the time out of your busy days to come and hear some, you know, really exciting work. So thank you all. Remember that our final meeting of the semester will happen the first Wednesday in November, and we will be talking about massive modularity in global value chains. So thank you all, and have a wonderful rest of your Wednesday.
Thank you very much for having me and for the great